Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some History Matters. This time, 10-minute history, the French Revolution, and Napoleon, short documentary. I don't know how you can cover this in 10 minutes. This is going to be a challenge, because there's just so much that happens, especially with Napoleon alone. I mean, we've watched a lot of Napoleon on this channel. That's been like we've had easily over like probably 20 hours of in total of videos watched of just Napoleon. So I don't know how they go. I'm curious as to how well they'll be able to cover this. I have faith in History Matters, but things can happen. Anyways, before we dive into the video, make sure you check out the links below in my description box or my pinned comment. Got a link to my Twitch channel and a link to my gaming channel here on YouTube. Love it if you threw me a follow on both of those and hung out in the chat when I go live on Twitch. So, French Revolution and Napoleon. Let's go ahead and dive right in.
1774, and King Louis XV of France is dead, and his grandson Louis XVI succeeds him. France at this point was Europe's greatest power, something which they wished to continue.
Small nitpick here. So there was never really one ultimate superpower for much of human history. They've always been kind of regional powers. Britain could be seen as perhaps at this time the first global superpower. However, yeah. So nitpick / correction. At this time, I would say France, not Europe's greatest power. They're pretty much tied for it. Great Britain and France kind of go back and forth on who's on top. It really depends. Obviously, on the seas, Britain's pretty much always on top. But with the land forces, it's France, right? So Britain's got the navy. The French have the finest military. Really, up until German unification, the French, for pretty much from like the start of the medieval times to, I'd say from Charlemagne to German unification, the French pretty much were the premier land power in Europe. Obviously, you could argue for some of that time period, the Byzantines really were on top because of how big they were. But I would largely argue France pretty much for most of that history. So certainly Europe's strongest land power. That is the truth. You could debate whether or not in 1774 if they were on top of Britain, because I think this is around the time when you could argue that they were probably at their closest power relation is the late 18th century here, just because of France being able to support the American Revolution, and that put a lot of strain on Britain and whatnot, and France was able to really contend pretty equally with them in that war. That was a long tangent.
Keeping this position from other European powers was costly and led to a series of expensive wars which essentially bankrupted France. At the top of the French government,
I would agree with that, yeah,
sat the king, the clergy, and the nobles, who together are known as the ancien regime. The ancien regime mostly didn't pay taxes, which meant financing France's position fell to everyone else, mostly the poor. This period also saw the height of the Enlightenment.
Fun fact, the nobility, but this also meant, so there were some downsides to being nobility, in the sense that the noblemen were not allowed to pretty much be merchants. The noblemen could not be, for this time period, they could not be slave traders, right? The lower class were able to gain wealth and become slave traders, but the nobility were not allowed, which is an interesting, interesting concept, that they are the most powerful people in the nation, yet they can't garner wealth through the slave trade. The lower classes are able to, but they are not.
Prominent French political philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire were challenging the political status quo. One major aspect of this was the king's divine right to rule, which meant that the king was king because that was what God wanted, so therefore shut up and do what he says. Ideas that challenged divine right to rule came from Britain with its constitutional monarchy and from the newly formed United States, who had decided that kings really weren't that necessary. France's aid to the American Revolution had secured independence for the colonies and had struck a blow against France's great rival. This, however, was not a cheap blow and threw France into even greater economic hardship. Louis appointed a series of finance ministers to fix the country's tax woes, but all failed simply because they couldn't get the clergy or the nobility to pay taxes. The peasantry were now starting to get restless since these tax problems hit them the hardest. A harvest failure led to the price of bread skyrocketing and riots broke out.
Oh, I love that they mentioned the a harvest failure. That's always like, you know, it's never just one thing that can cause things. It's always, there's multiple things happening, right? And a series of bad events cause, rising taxes, and then a bad harvest pretty much cements the doom for the established power here in France.
France was now in crisis, and so Louis called for the Assembly of the Estates General, which was a major legislative assembly which had not met for over 150 years. It represented the three great estates of France: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, everybody else. No solution could be found, so in order to speed...
Alright, so I was wondering if he was going to briefly mention it. He did not. The third estate, the voting system worked where each estate has one vote of power. And then, of course, since members of the clergy are also kind of typically sometimes, especially at this time, but I'd say this was perhaps more common during the medieval times, but it's probably carried over into this time period. Much of the clergy is also made up of former nobles, relatives of the kings, of lords and whatnot. So they're what they would like, the clergy and the nobleman, the first and second estates, their desires typically lined up because of that, and because of their shared privileged positions in the state. And then the third estate, of course, was the peasants and the merchants. Literally everyone, yeah, as he said, everyone else.
Speed things up, King Louis simply locked...
But yeah, so one vote each, so 2/3. 2 out of the 3 votes wins. Boom.
The third estate out because they were the ones who wanted change. The third estate then gathered in a nearby tennis court where they swore to continue meeting until a new constitution was established.
And then, of course, as we see here, there's a member of the clergy, and I think this guy right here is a nobleman. I want to say, I think there was a nobleman that joined in the tennis court oath. I can't remember the name of the nobleman.
Unsurprisingly, King Louis opposed all of this, but the people were much more supportive and formed the National Guard to protect the third estate.
The National Guard's main purpose was to suppress riots and to uphold the revolution.
Now called the National Assembly, against violent retaliation. To do so, they famously stormed the Bastille to free prisoners, but mostly to get guns.
Wasn't that the women that stormed? No, the women marched on Versailles, right?
National Assembly, now called the National Constituent Assembly, issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which established the rights of the French people. What makes this so important is that these rights came from the people, not from the king or God. The bread situation did not improve, and as such more riots broke out. A rumour started that the royal family were hoarding food, and as such rioters, mostly women, marched on the palace of Versailles. After a standoff and some violence, the king and his Austrian wife, the disdained Marie Antoinette, agreed to return to Paris where they'd be closer to the people. The revolutionaries started to punish the clergy and the nobles. The church could no longer levy taxes, and the revolutionaries also...
May, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 28 to 31 days in a month, 12 months in a year. Florial, 100 seconds in a minute, 100 minutes in an hour, 10 hours in a day, 30 days in a month, 12 months in a year. Began on September 22nd, 1792.
Also introduced a non-religious calendar. Many nobles fled to neighbouring countries and had their lands and wealth confiscated. These revolutionaries should not be seen as unified, however. They had different ideas on what France should be. Most revolutionaries, such as the Marquis de Lafayette, wanted to keep the monarchy, but the Jacobins, led by a certain Maximilien Robespierre, wanted its complete abolition altogether. After 2 years back in the capital and with much less power, Louis decided to flee to the protection of his brother-in-law, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. The royal family were recognised on the way and sent back to Paris, where they were seen as enemies of the revolution. Which they were. Louis and his wife's close ties with Austria meant that the revolutionaries were becoming concerned with external threats. To make matters worse, the Austrians and Prussians issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which gave their support to Louis against the revolution. This declaration was used as a pretext to war, although Robespierre opposed it, and in April 1792 France invaded the Austrian Netherlands, beginning the War of the First Coalition. This was a victory
Spoiler,
for
there's
France,
more.
with only Britain refusing to make peace. France annexed the Austrian Netherlands and invaded the Dutch Republic, which after...
What's funny is just the sheer amount, like, this really shows just how crazily, how much of a dominant land force France was. Because France at this time, one, we've already established that they had a poor harvest one year. They've had rising bread prices. Like, those don't get solved quickly, so they are still suffering from these issues. Third, there's a bunch of internal problems going on throughout the entire country, and yet they are still able to win a war against the Holy Roman Empire. Now, of course, the Holy Roman Empire by this time certainly is nowhere near its glory days of once being a actually properly unified force, and it was probably just Austrian soldiers that fought, and local forces, and probably no Prussians or something, who knows. I'm just speculating here, and then I don't know how many soldiers the British sent in, but yeah, with all these issues going on, France is still able to dominate war. That is
A
crazy.
popular uprising became the Batavian Republic, one of France's sister republics, which were essentially puppet states. Shortly afterwards, a second coalition, this time with added Russia, would declare war on France, but again, it was a French victory. Back in France, the revolution also cracked down on internal threats. In 1792, the king was deposed and a republic declared. He was later put on trial for treason and sentenced to death by one vote. Louis was beheaded by guillotine in January 1793, and Marie met the same fate shortly afterwards. Louis's death would be the first and the most famous phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. This was a period of mass suspicion where neighbour would accuse neighbour of betraying the revolution. Not seeming supportive enough was enough to have you arrested. The period also saw the execution of over 40,000 people, many by guillotine. Power at this point rested with the Committee for Public Safety, which was led by Robespierre. The terror became more and more paranoid until Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, but not before being shot in the face. After the fall of Robespierre, there was a period of stability when a new government, the Directory, was formed. This would last for 5 years before it was overthrown by a famous general, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Never heard of him. Who's he?
Who was subsequently declared first consul of France. Napoleon had risen...
You know, they're doing a really good job of covering this information in such a short time period. Obviously, they are simplifying things a lot and not covering certain things, but they're still doing a damn good
due to
job.
his successful military career. He first defeated the British at Toulon before leading a successful invasion of Italy. He was not always successful though, as demonstrated by his 1798 invasion of Egypt, which was rebelling against rule by the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon wanted Egypt to act as a launch pad for invading British colonies in Asia, but harassment by Ottoman and British forces meant that he had to return home, achieving nothing. After his coup, Napoleon oversaw a series of domestic reforms. One of the greatest changes to the government was that the bureaucrats and military officers were now promoted based on merit, not birth. To ensure the loyalty of those promoted, Napoleon created the National Order of the Legion of Honor, which people were admitted into based upon good service. He also sought to undo some of the harm done to the church by the revolution by restoring some power to it, but ultimately it answered to him. Some of Napoleon's most important changes were to the military. The French army was composed of conscripts who were gathered using France's efficient bureaucracy. The French army saw its administration improved, specifically how orders were relayed. The army developed a more effective medical service able to stem the outbreak of epidemics, as well as a sophisticated supply chain which meant that the soldiers no longer had to live off the land as much. In 1804, Napoleon was declared the Emperor of the French, formally ending the First French Republic and beginning the First French Empire. The next year he had himself crowned the King of Italy, which would act as a catalyst for another coalition against France. This war, the War of the Third Coalition, was the first of the Napoleonic Wars and one of the most famous. Britain had been an enemy of France since forever, and Napoleon was keen to knock it out of the war. To do so, he amassed
1. Invade. Step 2. Kill everyone. 3. Repeat step 2.
a huge army on France's northern coast, but for an invasion to happen, Napoleon had to neutralise Britain's greatest strength, the Royal Navy. Interestingly, in order
Status of waves. Ruled.
to finance the war, Napoleon sold his North American territories to the United States. The United States borrowed some of this money from British banks, which meant that the British were essentially funding a French invasion of themselves.
No fucking way. No way. I've never heard of that before.
Any hope of invading Britain was ended when the French and their ally Spain's combined fleet was destroyed at the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon fared significantly better on land against the continental powers. The army waiting to invade Britain marched into the Holy Roman Empire, and after some clever manoeuvring managed to secure the surrender of an Austrian army with very little bloodshed before capturing Vienna. The remnants of the Austrian army joined up with the Russians under Emperor Alexander. Napoleon gave the impression that his army was in shambles, which made the Allies confident enough to meet him at the Battle of Austerlitz. Here, Napoleon won one of his greatest victories, securing an Austrian surrender. This victory also saw the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which was dissolved shortly afterwards, becoming the Confederation of the Rhine, another French puppet state. French dominance would upset the Prussians, who
Things I will not stand. This
would shortly afterwards begin the War of the Fourth Coalition. Bad idea. French victory here saw the creation of a semi-independent Polish state called the Duchy of Warsaw, which was carved from Prussian territory. At this point, Napoleon had a firm grip over most of Europe, and he demanded that all those under his influence join the continental system, which was essentially a trade embargo aimed at bankrupting Britain. Portugal, Britain's closest ally, was reluctant to join, and so the French with their Spanish allies invaded in 1807, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. Spain was undergoing its own problems, and sensing weakness, Napoleon invaded Spain itself and installed his brother Joseph on the throne. The British then landed in Portugal.
a terrible mistake. He should. My personal belief here is that he should have just supported the current standing monarchy of Spain instead of trying to depose them. Because that just adds fuel to the fire that's already there.
Both nations teamed up with the Spanish rebels against the French, beginning the Peninsular War, which would last for 6 years. Simultaneously, the Austrians, undeterred by France never losing, began the War of the Fifth Coalition, which France shockingly won, giving them this territory. 3 years later, Russia was getting sick of being told what to do, and so started trading with Britain again. Napoleon's support for the neighbouring Duchy of Warsaw also made Tsar Alexander nervous of a possible French invasion. This fear was well founded, since in 1812 the French invaded Russia with a huge army numbering over 500,000. Napoleon won many costly victories and occupied Moscow. The Russians, however, had destroyed everything of value as they retreated, and when winter came around, Napoleon's army froze and starved, forcing him to retreat. Napoleon's failure in Russia led to the major powers of Europe, plus the now independent United Netherlands, forming a sixth coalition against the French. This time, the coalition managed to defeat Napoleon and occupied Paris. The Peninsular War also ended with an Allied victory, and Spain became an independent nation again. Napoleon then abdicated and was subsequently exiled to the island of Elba. Shortly afterwards, Louis XVI's brother, also called Louis because why rock the boat at this point, was crowned Louis XVIII, but unlike the previous monarchy, this one was bound by a constitution. Strangely, Napoleon was not happy with his exile and
oh my god. Cosimo was here. Cosimo di Medici
managed to escape Elba.
By the way, Medici Masters of Florence, I think is what the show is called. It's on Netflix. Great show. It's only 3 seasons, but I think they do a fantastic job. Obviously, they take creative liberties, but for the most part, I was pretty happy with how they covered historical information, and got some things right. Obviously, some things didn't really seem to care to get right, which is okay by me, just because it was still well written. As long as it's well written, I don't care if you take creative liberties, because, get it right. But yeah, first season, I believe, deals with Cosimo de' Medici, and then the second and third seasons deal with Cosimo's grandson. I believe Cosimo is played by Richard Madden from Game of Thrones, so check that series out. It's on Netflix. Freaking great. I loved it.
And returned to France.
Especially season 3. Season 3 was, I think, a great.
Louis XVIII bravely ran away to Britain, and Napoleon resumed his position as emperor. The countries that had just defeated the French were none too happy about this, and so formed the Seventh Coalition. The coalition was victorious, and Napoleon suffered his most famous defeat here by a joint Prussian-British army at Waterloo, and shortly afterwards was exiled to St. Helena, off the coast of Africa, where he remained until his death in 1821. Afterwards, the main powers of Europe established the Act of Vienna, which removed France's conquests and tried to establish a balance of power in Europe. The idea was to prevent a single nation from becoming too powerful and to prevent future wars, which went swimmingly. The legacy of the French Revolution was a fundamentally different France, whose republican ideals would never
Liberty, equality, fraternity
go away. It made Napoleon's rise to power and the subsequent wars possible, which saw France rise to its highest heights, but its downfall would leave Britain almost unchallenged for the next 100 years.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed.
I love that ending point there. Because France reached, essentially you could say because France reached too far, it gave Britain the ability to dominate all the world for the next 100 years, unchallenged. I think that's a great great thing that's a great ending note. They covered this information really well. I am surprised because it's a lot of information to cover. They did a damn good job. But this was 10-Minute History, the French Revolution, and Napoleon short documentary by History Matters. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.